and sealed.
Come quietly, or there will be... trouble. I stole that line from Deadpool 2. Anyway, RoboCop video games. With RoboCop Rogue City not far off release as I type these words and say them out loud, but maybe not as you watch this video, I thought it would be fun to chat about the representation of everyone's favourite icon of 80s anti-capitalist satire that had a blazing start before turning into a poor film, an awful film, and some hot garbage on the TV in both live action and animated forms. Honestly, the amount I love RoboCop is ridiculous when I actually sit back and consider how little love I have for any of the Metal Rosa's screen forays outside of the original movie. The sequel is okay, and it does have a place in my heart because I actually saw it before the original, bless you pirate VHSs, but everything else could be lost in a terrible warehouse fire and really nobody would care that much. But the video games, oh, the video games. At worst, they were garbage. At best, they were great in your memory, but really not all that when you went back to most of them. It's a pattern, and it's a question raised from that pattern. Why is it so hard to get RoboCop right in video games? He's a big robot man who blasts an endless array of perps with his metal wand of justice. He makes his way around plenty of different areas in Detroit. There are clearly defined bosses in his world and conspiracies to tackle. It's all, on the surface, a simple and straightforward journey from clanking cop on screen to clanking cop on screen with controller or joystick or sometimes mouse. But no Robo game has nailed it. Not in 35 years of Robo games. It all began simply enough, of course, with Data East doing what Data East did and plopping Murphy into a side-scrolling platformer shooter a year after the film it was based on had come out. RoboCop was superb fun back then. Sure, it didn't feel hugely different from the Dragon Ninjas of the world, bar the Metal Man and the firearms of course, but it had the right feel about it to help differentiate it in our hearts and minds. Even to this day, there's a pang of power trip joy when Robbie reaches that early point in the first level and plucks out the Auto 9 from his titanium-coated pocket. Up to that point, you've been bumbling along battering bad bastards with your iron fists of the law, and yes, I know they're actually titanium-coated Kevlar fists, it's just iron fist is a phrase and titanium-coated Kevlar fist isn't. Just when you realise you're starting to get shot at and wondering if you're going to have to throw hands at everyone in the game, the firearm emerges and the blasting commences. No, it's not much by today's standards, but I still have that emotional muscle memory firing up whenever I see the gun emerge. All that said, RoboCop's first outing was merely an arcade run-and-gun platformer. It was a huge success because of its licensing, I'm sure, but strip Robo out and put any other sprite in his place and you've got yourself a game that would likely do pretty well regardless. It was an 80s arcade game through and through, one with some brilliant home conversions, but it wasn't a representation of the future of law enforcement beyond the clanking, the shooting, and the Ed 209ing. By the time RoboCop's second movie outing came about, development of the next Robo game was already well underway. RoboCop 2 ended up arriving in a few different forms, but I think it's fair to say its main attraction was in the Amiga and Amiga-adjacent versions, landing a few months after the sequel movie arrived in cinemas. While there's a fair and, I'd say absolutely correct argument to be made that the cinematic RoboCop 2 is a parody of the original film, the video game versions trod a much more well-worn path. Robo 2, Amiga & Co. threw in some of that late 80s, early 90s depth by adding in more platforming to navigate, more power-ups and power-downs to pick up, and really irritating hover platform sections. Beyond that, well, it was a slightly different take on the first game, the same concept as viewed through a different lens. So, really, the game tie-in was arguably more like the movie it was based on than I thought. That's probably giving it too much credit though, because really this was just another run-and-gun platformer starring everyone's favourite proponent of what you think is propaganda if you don't actually watch the first film and just start bleating about it on Twitter. RoboCop 2 was, again, a video game first and foremost, with the actual RoboCop elements of it filling in some blanks after most of the groundwork had been laid. The same was true of the sequel on other formats too, where the game changed even less from the first game and really helped to highlight just how hard developers were finding it to make anything specifically RoboCop-y about their RoboCop games. Sure, he could take out dozens of baddies and barely take a scratch doing it. Also, he could jump, which wasn't something Tinny Alex was keen on in the films. But that wasn't anything unique in arcade games, home format games, any form of video games. The effort to up the ante in the arcade led to a fun game that did manage to mix things up more than it did back in the home, but RoboCop 2's coin-up release was really just another case of Data East doing Data East. A scrolling beat-em-up rather than a run-and-gun platformer. Really, it should be a plod-and-blast platformer, but I digress. Again, the core experience was a shallow and straightforward one that riffed little on the character and world on which it was based. Seriously, drop any other main character sprite into this game and you genuinely wouldn't be able to tell it was based on RoboCop. One chunk of kudos goes the way of Robo 2 Arcade Edition though, and that's in how you're able to walk one way while shooting the other. It's genuinely shocking that no other RobotCop game features this, as far as I'm aware, given it's an iconic element of Peter Weller's take on how you should tackle a drug manufacturing plant. And plie, and pirouette, and blast 'em. Really, it should be no surprise that game developers weren't quite sure how to represent Robo in their games when you look at the source material they were working with. When it came to RoboCop 3, the wheels had completely fallen off. I tried to think of a fitting metaphor for that metaphor here, involving the bit in RoboCop 2 where our hero has a pneumatic drill taken to him and we get to see his oh response, but I failed. Well, I can always unwieldily cram a mention of that fact into the script, like this here. At least it means I get to avoid thinking about RoboCop 3 for a little bit longer. Because yes, RoboCop 3, that was a film, wasn't it? Oh boy. As Robo had pivoted on screen to a more family-friendly affair and was soon to pivot even further into the world of TV movies and the complete death of satire, it would be fair to assume maybe the games might make a pivot of their own? Well, no. Not on console at least, where we ended up with a base SNES version setting out the stall for yet another platformer shooter and all the intense boredom that entailed. Even the addition of a jetpack couldn't save anything, both in the game and in the film, and it was around this point, if you were a console owner, you might well have just given up on Robo. I wouldn't have blamed you. What started out as a run of games with potential, fun titles that just needed a bit more character to make them stand out and really represent what it was to be a cyborg law enforcement officer, didn't really go anywhere. It remained static. It offered little in the way of creativity. But if you were A, on a home computer, and B, a year or two back in time before the console games, you'd be singing from a different hymn sheet, and all the songs would be going, oh. Because while it might have launched some 17 months before the film it was based on, and almost 2 years before English-speaking countries got the movie, RoboCop 3 on the Amiga, PC and Atari ST was a whole other kettle of creativity. This was the first time a RoboCop game actually got RoboCop, at least to some extent. Sure, there are things you can rarely get around in video games, like the main character's near invincibility, looking at you, all Superman games. But the plodding plod, the computer vision, the protecting the innocent and upholding the law, and the serving of the public trust, whatever that means, it was all there, present and correct, in a game that blew more than a few minds both tiny and large in the early 90s. The flat-shaded polygon look was familiar to Amiga gamers of the early 90s, with plenty of flight sims and racing games adopting the look. It was primitive in retrospect, sure, but at the time it was a phenomenally exciting way to experience a game. RoboCop 3 offered a glimpse into the future of gaming entertainment back in 1991, and even now, as long as you're able to stretch your eyeballs past the fact it looks more basic than your boyfriend's Spotify Wrapped, there's still a decently fun game to play. Bits of it even feel a wee bit like other games later on in this list, such was the influence of the Robohm computer versions of Robo 3. A mix of driving, flying the jetpack, and an early days FPS, almost more akin to Killer 7 than Doom, blended together with a basic but cinematic story, a tale that would modify and change as you played depending on how well or badly you did along the way. No, it wasn't the freedom of a GTA or the pure cinematic wonder of Bug Snacks, I know what I said. But RoboCop 3 Home Computer Edition was a trailblazer, full of great ideas, and it managed to nail a bit of what it was that needed to be nailed when it came to RoboCop in game form. I do sometimes wonder how much hype this version of the game created for RoboCop 3 the film, given how good the interactive version was, and how it had almost 2 years to build up excitement in people's brains before the cinematic disaster crashed into our brain sets. Did this ahead of its time gaming beaut help ruin the lives of many a crime-busting sci-fi fan? I do hope not. Back on the consoles again, a new outing for RoboCop helped create a whole new hype, one for a film to exist based on it. The first time Robbie had come to gaming devices without a movie attached, instead following a run of comics, RoboCop vs. the Terminator pitted Alex Murphy, RIP in peace, against an army of invading Cyberdyne Systems Model 101s. Almost exactly like Aliens vs. Predator, it was an idea that could work fantastically well in comics and in video games. And exactly like Aliens vs. Predator, it absolutely did not work fantastically well in its SNES incarnation. It would be unfair to expect a SNES game in 1993 to stand on the shoulders of an Amiga and PC technological powerhouse like Robo 3, but all the same, Roboterm was a step back for cybernetic representation in the gaming world. Once again returning to those well-worn streets and mixing a jumping man-tank with ever-blasting gun violence, RVTT, well, here's me saying it again, you swap out the sprites for anything nondescript and non-licensed and you've got yourself exactly the same game with exactly the same feel to it. All the RoboCop bits did was exactly what the Terminator bits did, got more eyeballs on the product. The game was a dull slog though. Needlessly difficult, banal, not really capturing the spirit of the comics it was based on. The SNES version was a letdown, the Game Boy version forgettable at best, and the Master System version merely based on, well, the Mega Drive game. That one game everyone thinks of when they think of movie games, even though it's not based on a movie specifically. And sure, sticking with the theme of this video, RoboCop vs. the Terminator on Sega's 16-bit machine was yet another game to miss the USPs of a robotic law enforcement officer. But it was a hell of a fun time all the same. Looking at it with modern eyes, the hoo-ha about this one seems so ridiculous. It's gory, and nameless criminals explode in a shower of viscera from a mere bullet or two popped into their torsos, sure, but it's tame even by standards of the day. We were up to Mortal Kombat 2 by 1994, with MK3 not far off. That, along with all its imitators, meant players were already up to their eyeballs in eyeballs, and other such assorted body paraphernalia. Still, it's the violence Robo vs. Termi is remembered for, and it's the violence that bagged the game a lot of attention way back in the heady days of the mid-90s. Legitimately though, it was a better game on Mega Drive than on any other format. Snappier, more satisfying to play, the violence did actually contribute to that element, and generally not just an example of the sort of vapid, meandering licensed tosh the SNES version absolutely was. Peter vs. Arnold on the Mega Drive was good, and it is still fun now. It was well received, and it still makes retrospective best-of lists. But it wasn't really RoboCop, was it? Nor was the Game Boy Color game, which reminds me a fair bit of Alien 3 on Game Boy, though Robbie's handheld game features 0 instances of Brian Glover popping up and is therefore infinitely worse. The setting of this one actually mixed things up and moved away from the obvious let's do another platformer with a shooting route, instead opting for an almost Zelda-like top-down exploration and combat thing. You would identify bad guys and not shoot innocent bystanders, well, not on purpose, but beyond that it was little more than a weird sidestep in the increasingly odd adventures of Robocop in video game land. And when things moved to the Game Boy Advance, they were all set to yet again go back to the gaming series' roots and offer some punching and shooting on a side-scrolling plane. Fortunately for all involved, RoboCop GBA was cancelled, so nobody ever played it, especially not me, for this video using a dumped ROM I found and downloaded with true ease. Whatever the case, Titus, early noughties license holder of RoboCop in game form, looked to have completely misunderstood the brief when it came to making games that actually hit the right notes in representing Paul Verhoeven's take on a modern American Jesus. But, just like historical, non-American Jesus, Titus rose from its grave to have a much better pop at getting RoboCop right, in a game, for the third time in a row, named RoboCop. And yes, I think I did just get Jesus mixed up with Altered Beast there. Ah well, RoboCop's outing in RoboCop, a game based on the hit movie, TV and animated series franchise RoboCop, wasn't very good at all as a game. Had it arrived 5 years earlier in the PS1 generation, we might all be here hailing it as a pathfinder for the modern console FPS. Given that's not what happened though, that didn't happen. Instead, we were left with this utter trudge of a game. A painfully basic console-style FPS that absolutely crumbled in the face of the competition it faced on the non-home computer platforms of the day. Halo was out, Red Faction had happened. Time Splitters 2 wasn't a daydream, it was real. RoboCop had nothing on any of these games, to the point it was only released in the States on Xbox and barely raised its head above any parapets on PS2, GameCube and PC elsewhere in the world. All that said, it did hark back to RoboCop 3 on Amiga and Co to bring the best representation of OCP's first non-suicidal anti-crime manbot we'd seen since the game that was based on the movie that came out years after the game itself arrived. RoboCop in 2003 wound things back 10 years to give us a first-person stomp 'em up, throwing players into the oh-so-heavy boots of Robert and having him do some of those things you should be doing if in those very shoes. On paper it meant following the prime directives, it meant helping people who needed the help, and it meant balancing being an all-powerful robot man-tank holding a frankly ludicrous gun with classic pre-social media filmic interpretations of the police being there to help the citizenry. What it amounted to in the game itself was an FPS where you didn't just kill everyone. Sometimes you had to rescue people, and sometimes enemies would give up after taking 15 bullets to the gonads. The spirit of RoboCop was very much present in RoboCop, but it just didn't hit the landing when it came to feeling like you were playing as RoboCop in RoboCop. Thankfully, mobile gaming lifted off through the 2000s and beyond, so we could once again play more brand new, completely different games based on RoboCop that were called RoboCop, like 2004's RoboCop and 2014's RoboCop. The earlier RoboCop was it was another one riffing on the original arcade game. I didn't play it because I couldn't. I'm sure it's bad. Nobody in the world cares that it exists, and it does nothing particularly RoboCop-y. The 2014 edition of RoboCop, meanwhile, was the first one based directly on a movie since the mid-90s. Yes, it was the tie-in with the franchise's filmic reboot, and just like that film, it had some decent ideas, but was let down by its toothlessness, its banality, and the fact that it seemed to embrace a lot of the modern corporate-endorsed capitalist vulture tendencies that the original couple of Robo movies railed against. The microtransactions in this game were money-grubbing nonsense of such heavy-handed ridiculousness they'd make Dick Jones and his weird long arms blush. So RoboCop 2014, based on RoboCop 2014, managed to out-OCP, but did the Android-era cyborg game hit it out of the park with the RoboCopness? Well, no. And that brings us back to the ultimate question here. How do you do it? How do you make it so a game based on RoboCop actually hits the right notes? RoboCop is near indestructible, but players need to fear a fail state, so he has to be vulnerable to even the most pathetic of street punk attacks. RoboCop is the personification of one man's fierce personal moral code, clad in metal and armed with the tools to bring his own brand of enlightenment to all those on the streets of Detroit. But players aren't Alex Murphy, they're a walking tank sent to mop up waves of faceless goons. RoboCop, and when I say this I mean the original movie RoboCop, both the character I know and the film I love more than most other things in life. RoboCop is a Jesus allegory, a ham-fisted yet still utterly scathing critique of modern Western capitalism. RoboCop the Machine Man is what happens if the American auto industry were let loose with a corpse and a defense contractor's budget. RoboCop the film is a pastiche of Hollywood ultraviolence presented as a deadpan recreation of that very violence, just turned up to 11. RoboCop sees sickeningly sadistic criminals who you can't help but laugh along with as they have the time of their lives, pitted against a police force made up of characters named after serial killers. It comments on the ever-increasing militarization of the world around us, while sprinkling in half-seen and half-heard clips from a comedy show with an utterly nonsensical catchphrase that plenty of people in real life still repeat. RoboCop, as I've said a few times already, is a tank, and he moves like one. A graceful one, thanks to the balletic and mime influence on Peter Weller's work as the character, but still a tank. Slow, plodding, determined, unstoppable. There's grace to the man-bot, sure, but that's certainly not backed by haste. The bad guys' RoboCop battles are shown there in black and white, and they get their comeuppance, but the overall picture isn't changed. The status quo remains, and the truly powerful keep hold of their true power. And Murphy, while we're happy he's reclaimed some of his humanity by the end of the first film, is complicit in being perfectly happy at this outcome. RoboCop mixes its pulpy notes of extreme violence and base-level humour with a smack-you-around-the-face level of dystopian satire, sprinkled with a biblical allegory on the level that literally shows our hero walking on water, not to mention this coming after his death and resurrection. It is a movie that bites the hand it feeds, while also sneering at the public that made it into the long-running franchise it ended up being. It isn't a nice world, it isn't a nice story, it isn't a nice outcome. Murphy is still for all intents and purposes dead. OCP still runs everything, the city is still bollocksed. So it does come as absolutely no surprise to me that the film series nosedived following that first movie, much as I do like the second one. And it's even less of a surprise that the character was licensed and watered down to appeal to as many impressionable potential merchandise purchasers as possible. It was impossible to keep the rhythm and tempo of that first film going, so the masters in charge of the purse strings just followed the path of least resistance and highest possible profit. All that in mind, is it any wonder no RoboCop game has ever really managed to hit the right notes of what makes the character appealing and what makes the world so engaging? Alex Murphy's Afterlife isn't a setting that works for video games. I would argue it's impossible to truly translate to the interactive world. He's a character with his own issues and struggles to live through. He's a man with a strong personal moral code about him. So any player playing as him either has to engage in that flawlessly or just ruin the character. It just doesn't work. So, no. I'm not confident RoboCop Rogue City will nail the Robo feeling, is what I'm saying. I played the demo and I did actually have fun, but I've seen how he walks in those cutscenes and I can see many other frayed edges. And you've probably already seen the reaction to it hasn't been particularly positive in the most part. It feels more RoboCopy than any previous Robo game I've played, and it certainly nails the presentation. Good God, man, Peter Weller is reprising the role for the first time since, Mortal Kombat and some KFC adverts. Still though, I don't know where Rogue City will land quality-wise, but I just think, like some literary projects are unfilmable, the rise, fall and rebirth of Alex Murphy is ungameable. He don't like games, so games don't like him. Two shout-outs before the Patreon shout-out. First to RoboDoc, the documentary about the making of RoboCop. They didn't sponsor me or ask me to mention it specifically, but I did get sent a copy to watch, which I really should finish doing at some point. Peter Weller might be a complete bellend, but the man is interesting to listen to. And secondly, a shout out to Rogue City developer Teyon's previous game, Terminator Resistance. It's a 6 out of 10, but I will take a solid 6 out of 10 made with passion over an identikit guaranteed 9 made by Faceless Megacore number 102. It's just how my brain rolls. I should do a video on Resistance at some point, and I genuinely hope RoboCop's next game outing hits me the same way the last Terminator one did. Thanks for watching, and thanks to my patrons on Patreon. You are the ones who really help me to serve the public trust, protect the innocent, and uphold the ability to go undercover for 20 years, form a relationship with an activist I'm investigating, convince them I love them, have kids with them, and do it all while maintaining the illusion I'm a normal person and not a Rosa on the clock. Ha! British policing at its finest. I fell down a bit of a hole there. Patrons! I'm off to wait the almost a year until it's my birthday again, the day on which I always watch RoboCop and take utter delight in seeing how much closer to a documentary it's become in the 12 months since last watching. Bye!
Come quietly or there will be trouble.